You know, I got a quick question.
Yes,
So I
Mitch.
really appreciated your talk today. How have some of your large corporate customers taken your plans of, your forecast of them fundamentally changing their businesses for 2 to 7 years? How are they reacting to that? Are they buying into it or are they obstinate?
Oh, actually, the ones I work with are buying into it quite well, partially because it's sort of a selection bias where they chose to work with me previously, and so they know my work, they rely on it. So, let's say my contact at Xerox, she's the head of training and development in Xerox. She's getting me into Xerox to she's buying into it and she's trying to convince the rest of the leadership in Xerox to do that by getting me in to do presentations on it. My contact at Experian is the head of digital content and marketing. So he's getting me in to do a presentation, a webinar to the leadership to get them to buy into it. It's much slower for corporations to buy into it. So what happens is that my immediate contacts within those corporations, folks who I worked with, folks who are immediate clients, whether it's the kind of people in leadership positions in training and development, which is who I often work with, or people who are the heads of business units, regional business units, then they buy into it and they try to convince others. It's a pretty slow process for large corporations to go into it, but my immediate contacts are definitely buying into it and they're working to convince others in the corporations. So I'm strongly guessing that you'll see Experian, that you'll see Xerox, you'll see other clients I work with moving more quickly in that direction of accepting this and fundamentally changing their business models.
Cool.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So we work in entertainment. Yeah. So with theme parks. So what do you see as like potential outcome with these major theme parks like Disney and Universal?
Not good. People will be very worried and scared to go there. Especially parents with kids. They will not want that situation to be impacting them. So I think they'll eventually open with social distancing. People will be very worried and scared of going there, and they will not make it out of this situation well. I mean, think about the 4 years of decreased revenues, maybe 25% of the revenue that they used to get. What will they do? And you can't. Their costs are not. They have their expenses for operating the theme park. You still have a lot of expenses, even if you can cut a lot of staff. If you have 25% of the paying customers, you can't cut 25%. You can't cut 75% of your expenses, right? So you can't get your costs down to 25%. And so this is not a good scenario for them. I would strongly encourage you to look for other clients as a way of focusing on the future, people who are going to be more adapt to this new environment.
On the flip side of that equation, though, I mean, we're all trapped at home and we have a demand essentially to come out and entertain ourselves. How do you think people would relieve that demand in the future?
I'm strongly suspecting that people will focus on a combination of using platforms like Zoom and augmented and virtual reality. I strongly think that augmented and virtual reality will take off as people realize the seriousness of the situation. I know augmented reality and virtual reality is currently kind of crappy. Sorry for anyone who works in that space, but it hasn't taken off nearly as fast as people in that space has thought it would. But I think right now there's a lot of opportunity for it, and people will be relieving their worry anxiety through these means, not through entertainment. They'll be really worried. They'll be really scared. I mean, if you look at polls, what people are actually saying and thinking, they are much more worried about the economy being opened up too quickly than they're worried about it being opened up too slowly. You're seeing protests, but polls are what show what consumers will actually do. And I think a lot of people will spend much more time at home, even after the COVID, 4 years, COVID-19 will be over. You'll have a lot of people who'll be much more homebodies and they'll be staying in much more. And so the recovery will be much slower than a lot of people. We will not have a V-shaped recovery. A lot of people are greatly underestimating the problem that we're experiencing. Sorry.
Do you see a Ready Player One scenario, essentially?
Pardon me?
Like a Ready Player One scenario where everybody's just in a pod?
I think that people will some people will try to yo-yo and they will lose out because they're yo-yoing and they're destabilizing their routines, they're destabilizing their employees, they're destabilizing their businesses. They are back, they are back. That's not a scenario you want to be in. So I think that we'll spend much more time at home in the future, and the smart businesses will adapt to that right now and change their business model, external and internal, right now to adapt to that future. I think people will spend much more time at home, socially distanced in various ways, and there will be a great shift to that. Now, after COVID-19 is over, people will slowly start to come out of these spaces. You will not have a massive rush. People will be worried. People will be scared. There will be conspiracy theories that COVID-19 is still around. The vaccine is not effective. And maybe sometime the vaccine, we can have a vaccine that's only 50% effective, that's only 80% effective. And there will be a bunch of people who don't want to take that risk. So you'll have a very slow, gradual emergence. Eventually, I think we will get to a stage, maybe 80% of where we were with in-person entertainment and activities. But I think there will be a permanent shift for a number of people. Other folks?
Where do you see the optimistic view in the future for sports teams, fans coming in, not necessarily having games, but having fans in the stands and concerts?
I don't think that there's too much hope in the immediate future for medium-term future for sports teams and fans in stands. I think there's definitely opportunities for sports teams to play behind closed doors. And for that to happen, you need to have very strong security, and for sports figures themselves to be very strongly protecting themselves against COVID-19. Because, if you have COVID-19 spreading in a sports team, it spreads very quickly, and that's very dangerous. So that will be a big concern. And then you want to, it depends on some sports, right? Tennis will probably be there faster than basketball, which is much more face-to-face, right? So those are things that you want to be thinking about. They'll be playing behind closed doors for a long while. And think about stadium. So how do you go into a stadium? You have to go through very narrow spaces. People are very close to each other. It's very hard to create social distancing in an actual stadium. So this is not going to be a good future for sports teams that want paying fans in the stands. You will have definitely opportunities for sports teams to broadcast games, because a lot of their money they're actually obviously they get from TV. So that will be more of an opportunity. So that's something that I'm thinking about. In concerts, you'll have a lot more video conference concerts. You'll have a lot more people broadcasting their concerts. That's going to be much more of the kind of thing that you'll see happening, rather than concerts that are happening in the moment, where people can just go and see the concert, especially big concerts. Think about the liabilities, right? If you knowingly put on a concert where there's going to be serious danger of people getting COVID-19, and then they sue you afterward, well, what are you going to do, right? Sports teams, same thing. You have to think about the liabilities here. There's very clear evidence that there's a lot of danger in having various events where you can't guarantee social distancing, and you really can't guarantee social distancing in a concert. You can't guarantee social distancing in a stadium. Some people are going to be dumb, and there are lots of people right now out there who are ignoring COVID-19. They're only staying home because their businesses are closed, or police enforcement actions, right? So there's going to be people are protesting this. So how can you protect yourself against these COVIDiots who think that COVID-19 is just a hoax and so on? So this is going to be difficult, and really, especially in mass crowd venues. So there's not too much hope for these venues to have fans in the stands until there's a vaccine.
What do you see as far as trade shows, conventions? What do you think that's going to look like going forward? Will they be canceled? Will they be altered in some way?
I think there's more hope for trade shows and conventions because there's much more kind of focus on professionalism, but it'll be much more limited. So you'll have much more limited amount of tickets. You'll have some ways that you won't be able to come up and interact face to face with this person, and whether you're going to the convention or you're displaying at the convention. So you'll have to figure out some way of creating a distanced exhibit, creating a distance exhibit booth. So shouting across 10 feet, which is really a safe distance. 6 feet is minimal. You want to ideally have 10 feet. So some way of conveying that information. I think there will be some of these, but they'll be much more limited. They'll have to be ticketed. The spaces will have to be limited. And so a lot of people just won't go. They'll transition to virtual exhibits, virtual conventions. because it'll be more convenient, easier. A bunch of people won't want to travel. I mean, who wants to get on an airplane nowadays, right? I have some speeches coming up in Kansas City, and I'm kind of dreading getting on an airplane because, this is not something I want to do right now. But that's how I make my money. So this is something that, and that's kind of for a very small group training. That's why they're still allowed to have under 10 people. And that is going to be a very serious difficulty. If people are not going to travel, how are they going to get to a venue? So this is something that you want to be thinking about. I think exhibits, conventions will be much more limited, much more ticketed, and there will be much less people who will be willing to go to them.
I have a question, Dr. Gleb. Thank you for joining us here. Knowing what you know about human behavior, and I think your perspective, although it comes from a very good place, I don't think many Americans share your perspective on the 2-year, 4-year, 7-year plan.
Of course they don't.
And so knowing what you know about human behavior, and if we believe that we might be in for even the optimistic view, let's say a 2-year or 4-year deal with this, what are your thoughts on Americans and the increasing amount of civil unrest, and which direction do you think that might head?
I think there'll definitely be increasing civil unrest. I mean, look at the kind of protests that are happening in a number of states right now, and especially, elections coming up, right? So there'll be more and more pressure. A lot of people who are COVIDiots will want to ignore COVID-19, think it's a hoax, whatnot. They will be thinking that, hey, this is not a big deal. Well, why are you holding us back from doing, hanging out outside, or of course, much more seriously, making a living? A lot of people will feel that, and they will be more and more protesting and rebelling, and that will cause more problems. That will cause more restrictions. So what I'm guessing will happen is that a number of people who are staying at home, when there's going to be an initial loosening, they will go out and they will not observe social distancing guidelines. They will not treat the COVID-19 seriously, and they will cause many more people to get sick than would be the case if people respect social distancing guidelines. It's one of the reasons why secondary outbreaks occurred even in countries, in Asian countries, that have more discipline than the US. So you will have more quick shutdowns. You'll have a spike of cases more quickly than it would be the case if people are actually disciplined. And then you will have shutdowns again, and people will be countering that. There will be civil unrest. And so you'll have a lot more conflicts going on in American society. And that's something that you want to be prepared for as well. That's one of the things that I talked about in terms of major disruptions. I didn't want to go into kind of personal preparation, but that's something you definitely want to be prepared for. And to the extent that your business might be impacted by these disruptions, civil unrest, you want to be prepared for that as well.
Okay.
Other folks?
So I guess this will affect retail as well, where
Absolutely.
will be like a small number of people can go walk into a retail store and people will be lining up outside the store.
Yes, it will hugely impact retail. You already see a huge growth in e-commerce, obviously, and it will continue. Some people who tried e-commerce for the first time will like it well enough that they'll keep doing it. I mean, you have some older people who never did e-commerce before, ever. And now they're going to try it and go, oh, this is not bad. I don't have to go to the store, don't have to browse things, protected from COVID-19. And especially older people, they will be much more focused on doing retail online than in person. In general, retail was kind of going out anyway, right? We all know that retail was being really damaged. A number of companies were going bankrupt. And over time, this COVID-19 will only exacerbate the situation. It will be even more damaging for retail than it was before. So a number of retail chains that are not well adapted to COVID-19 will go bankrupt. I mean, grocery stores will still be doing well. I think some home improvement department stores like Home Depot or Lowe's will still do okay because people really want home improvement supplies once they realize how stuck they are at home, and especially in the winter when they don't have anything to do, like the vegetable garden planting outside. So I definitely plan to do more home improvement in the winter. Right now I'm doing much more gardening, and I think a whole bunch of other people will do that as well. So that's one of the things that you want to be creative about. You want to get ahead of the shifts, figure out what the shifts are, and what the dynamics are, and how you can adapt to the changing habits before they happen.
Okay, so Dr. Gleb, I have another question.
Yeah.
Based on what you're saying, if somebody said that you were pessimistic, which I don't think you are, but if somebody said that, and they looked at the best case scenario, they would look at, I guess, some of the facilities like the auto industry where they're taking temperatures of people as they walk in and letting them come to work. I don't know, is that sustainable? Is that a model that other businesses are going to monitor and consider, or is it going to be way too much liability for corporate America to let people come back in, or obviously schools? Because I can't see that doing that for a long time, like you said. So.
Yeah, it's going to be, my thoughts are that I'm just telling you, like, I mean, I write my book, Never Go With Your Gut, how I'm a very optimistic person. If I wasn't an optimistic person, I wouldn't be an entrepreneur. I mean, as you all know, half of all startups fail in the first 5 years, 2/3 fail in the first 10 years, 3/4 fail in the first 15 years. I wouldn't be doing the EO. I run a company called Disaster Avoidance Experts, as you know, and that took a lot of optimism to start. I have 20 ideas before breakfast, and I think they're all brilliant. I think the grass is green on the other side of the hill, even though it's often yellow. And this is something that is just an inherent part of my personality. And that makes it even more challenging for me to accept the optimistic case of 2 years and also realize that it's very optimistic, less than 5%. I try to not let my optimism influence my judgments, and I make sure to run it by filtered through experts when I'm creating these scenarios of the future. So you want to think about getting an outside perspective on the scenario of the future. Now, the auto industry, that will not last. That's not something that's really effectively sustainable, because a lot of people, there's going to be liability. And for non-essential businesses, auto industry in some cases is defined as an essential business. The auto industry is going to really struggle. A lot of people are going to drive a lot less, of course, so there's going to be a lot of problems. The auto industry is not a model that you want to adopt. You want to focus on what will be the reality of loosening restrictions, tightening restrictions, especially because a lot of people will not be following the restrictions as they should. And so you will be, if you try to go to that model, you'll be yo-yoing back and forth. You don't want to be yo-yoing back and forth. You don't want to go to the office, go home, go to the office, go home. Half of the team go to the office, half of the team stay home. Half the team go to the office, half the team stay home. You'll have a lot of liabilities if you do that, first of all. If people get sick and they die from COVID-19 from preventable actions because lawyers can show that really you should have known that people will not socially distance themselves as they should. And there will be many lawyers who will be trying to jump on this. This is good for the legal profession, unfortunately. A lot of people will be trying to, and I say this as someone who works with lawyers. I have a legal firm, so hopefully they're not watching this. But anyway, they will be jumping on this opportunity, unfortunately, for many entrepreneurs like us. So you don't want to put yourself in that situation. You'll have to completely reconfigure your office. You'll have to make it socially distanced. You'll have to have a lot of cleaning and scrubbing, and that's just not going to be worth it. The trade-offs are really not going to be worth it for you. That's why I'm strongly encouraging you to right now take advantage of you having checked out this webinar and take advantage of the fact that your competition will not, and change your business model to make it virtual, change your internal business model, change your external business model. That's how you're going to succeed in this incredibly disrupted future. And for the next 4 years, realistically speaking, super optimistically speaking, the next 2 years, this is what we'll be facing.
I had a question. So I'm in the wedding industry. So we're a print and bind manufacturing.
Yep.
We make photo albums. So all of our customers are wedding photographers. How far out do you think it'll be before, a lot of people think that it's going to turn more into elopements and small intimate weddings, and it's going to be a long time before there's 150 people, 250 people, grandma, showing up to a wedding. What do you think about that?
I think it won't be until the vaccine. I think we'll increasingly see, we're already seeing a lot more of elopements, a lot more virtual weddings. So you're seeing a lot more virtual weddings. You're seeing a lot more people who are inviting people, like virtual birthdays. You're having virtual weddings where there's, socially distanced couple, their parents, and then everybody else is congratulating them, watching for Zoom. You'll have a lot more of that. You'll have many less gatherings over 10 people that will take place. So those wedding photographers will not be having a very good business until there's a vaccine, realistically 4 years, super optimistically 2 years. And even then, some people will have gotten used to the dynamics. That's what I'm saying about changing norms, changing habits. Some people will be like, well, why do we need to pay for 100 people getting together, for, you know, for everyone getting together, for wedding shots, wedding videos, when we can instead do the ordinary thing of that everybody has been doing for the last 2 to 4 years of doing weddings through Zoom. That's going to be the popular thing, and it will normalize things. So even after that, that's going to be definitely one of the shifts, that people will not be going back to the 150 people wedding immediately. Many people will just keep doing the cheap wedding. That will be the normal thing. There will not be an expectation of 150 people wedding. Now, wedding photographers can still do a business through 6 people appearing at a ceremony and getting some photographs of that, but that'll be a much, much less lucrative business.
Yeah, I mean, there's the model for elopements is actually, people still pay the same amount for photography, whether it's, you know, 200 people are going to be there or just the bride and groom are going to be there. And there's already been a huge trend for adventure elopements to prior to COVID-19 of people saying we want to get married in Iceland. And like you're saying, the younger community, they're more experience based anyways. They spend their money on concerts over cars. And so they'd rather get married in Iceland with just 3 or 4 people and then share the most crazy, insane photos than have a low budget wedding because they had to have 200 guests. So, but yeah, so it's a good thing to think about. But I guess you don't think that the camaraderie of, you know, hugging grandma on the dance floor and all that kind of.
You don't want to kill grandma. Again,
right, you don't want to kill grandma.
50%, yeah. I mean, what the first question that was asked is very relevant. 50% of all people who have COVID-19 don't know they have COVID-19. That's what the studies show. That means that I can have it, you can have it without knowing it. It's very easy. You don't show symptoms, but you can kill grandma. So do you want to put grandma at that risk? You know, one of my close friends is right now thinking about whether to help his mom travel across the country to live near here, Columbus, Ohio. And he's very seriously thinking about realizing that, hey, how is he going to do that? Because he wants her to be close in case of stuff happening with COVID-19. And so he's very much thinking through various ways that he won't infect her, that he will wear a mask, that he will take various steps to protect her from him, because he is a real danger to her. He's a real threat to her. So, and he has a job that requires him to be on the front lines as a first responder. So he's not able to just, you know, spend 14 days without going out of the house. This is a tough situation for a lot of people. And I don't think that people will want the smart people, which, and hopefully by now most Americans who are aware that older people are much more at risk, they will not want to put grandma at risk by hugging her on the wedding floor.
You don't think there will be like a form of testing that comes out for people to know within an hour if they're positive or negative, and then be able to say, okay, everybody that's tested negative, we can all hang out together and should be fine?
I think that will be difficult just because of how quickly you can pick up COVID-19. So are you going to test yourself before every event where you go to people, where you go to see grandma? It's going to get prohibitively expensive. That's one. Second of all, I mean, look at the testing regime that the US has set up. It's laughable, you know, to see that the kind of companies, you know, the government is very much focused on trying to open up the economy. You know, you're in California, you know that Newsom is saying, in order to open up the economy, we need testing, right? And there's no testing because of a shortage of various supplies, which are coming from, because of our supply chains for testing equipment is very much reliant on China and India and other countries that have closed down due to COVID-19. So COVID-19 is indeed preventing the widespread development of testing. So I think it'll be really hard to envision in the, you know, before a year from now. Maybe in a year things will be different. I mean, it's hard to predict a year from now with specific manufacturing of things, but the testing will be still difficult to get for the short-term future at least. And even in the longer-term future, even let's say in a year from now, each test will probably be pretty expensive. So you will not want to test yourself every time before you go hang out with grandma, before you hang out with friends. Maybe that once a year, maybe before a wedding, you can do that, you can afford that. So that's possible. But what are you going to do if you test yourself, if you test positive? It's a hard dilemma, and it's hard to figure this out. I think a lot of people won't want to take that risk.
Sure. Yeah.
Dr. Gleb, I have a question. What about the people that have worked through it and they say are no longer able to get infected?
Mm-hmm.
Are they suddenly going to be like the MVPs that everybody wants to hire and put in positions facing the public?
They will be mostly. So right now we've had some concerning cases where people who got the COVID-19, went through it, are still infectious without realizing it. So where there's called a reinfection in a number of countries, China, South Korea, there have been studies showing that people who had COVID-19, who developed antibodies, are still potentially infectious for it. So there's not sufficient information right now to say whether, hey, if you had COVID-19, you're no longer vulnerable to it. You're probably yourself no longer vulnerable to it, but you might well be able to give it to others. So there's still going to be some, I would say that probably in the next 3 to 6 months, we'll get a more clear answer on that. So that's something kind of a pretty short-term situation. And ideally, those people who will have gone for COVID-19 will now be able to be on the front lines and say, hey, I've had COVID-19, you want to hire me to do this job. And then that would be ideal, that would be great. That's probably, if you've heard that the government is looking for antibodies tests. And that is what they're trying to determine. How many people have antibodies to COVID-19, which means that they had it before. And then that's a separate question from, can they still give it to other people? Are they still infectious? And that's something we still have to determine.
You mentioned the automotive industry, that miles driven is going to be down, and it's probably going to be down for a long time as people stay home. What do you think about the trucking industry, which so far is down, but not as much as light duty?
Yeah, I think trucking industry will not be down nearly as much because there's a huge demand for logistics, right? And people get their job, their jobs depend, their money income depends on being able to drive their trucks. And there are more, I think, so the trucking will not be nearly as heavily impacted, negatively impacted. Of course, there will be some impact because truckers get sick. There's going to be much more social distancing, and some of the supply chains, which are majorly disrupted right now, have to be reconfigured. But I would say that trucking, during the COVID-19 pandemic, trucking will not be impacted that much, although there will be some decrease. Well, of course, the recession will cause, just to be clear, the recession will cause a decrease. So of course, which is completely separate from COVID-19, we're going into a major recession, as of course everybody knows. So that will of course impact trucking just as it will impact other industries.
Dr. Gleb, what are your thoughts on the travel industry and when you think that's going to open back up? Do we have to wait for a vaccine until that happens too?
Well, I'm going to be traveling to Kansas City, as I mentioned, to give a presentation. So there will still be some travel happening, but it will not be nearly as extensive, nearly as much as it used to be. Right now, for example, in public transportation, you have to maintain social distance. And there's going to be a bunch of people who know that some other people will not be maintaining social distance, that they will be idiots, they will ignore it, they won't take these steps that they need to. So a lot of people who can potentially use public travel just aren't. They don't want to take the risk. They don't want to take the risk of other people being stupid. How much do you count on other people being smart? I don't count on other people being too smart. That's just as a basic presumption. So I'm reluctant and I'm wary of doing public travel. And when I'll be going for the airport, you can bet I'll be wearing a mask and all the stuff that washing my hands off and all the stuff that I need to. But I'm doing that only as something that's really important for my financial livelihood. I won't be traveling otherwise. I won't be traveling for fun. I think you will see many less people traveling for fun, many less people traveling for entertainment, and people who potentially can avoid traveling for work will avoid traveling for work. So I think until we have the vaccine, the travel industry will not be much better because there will be restrictions and loosenings, and people will be worried, they'll be scared, there'll be anxiety, and that will impede travel seriously.
Okay, Doctor?
Yep. Whoever, the woman who was first, I think, whoever said that.
Wendy, hi.
Hi,
Thanks
Wendy.
for doing this. How are you? So my question is, in your mind, have you thought about how you weigh the damage of hundreds of thousands of people dying versus hundreds of thousands and millions of people being unemployed, homeless, not having money for food, those types of things? How do you weigh those two things in your head?
It's a very hard thing for me to weigh, so I don't look at myself. I don't, because that's a moral question. It's a values question, right? So I have certain values, but I'm not the one making the decision. I'm not the one who's making the call. Government officials are the ones making the call. So I'm simply observing their behavior. And they're clearly, very clearly, the overwhelming majority of governors, some are still keeping their states open, don't have shutdown orders, but the overwhelming majority of governors, based on the advice of scientific experts, Anthony Fauci and so on, are keeping shutdowns, and they are heavily weighing human life. So my decisions are separate from the ones who are making the decisions. I'm an analyst, and I look at what's actually happening. And in the reality that is happening, they're clearly highly weighing the people's health and people not dying. So we as business owners, whatever our private opinions about how we should weigh these things, it's not our call. It's the call of government officials, top-level leaders, mostly governors. So in that sense, we have to figure out how they will respond. We have to have a mental model of how they will behave, how they will react. And we already have clear evidence of how they're acting. And we can anticipate that based on their current actions, they will take the same actions. They've clearly all said that if there's going to be a loosening, and then there's going to be a gradual, then there's going to be an increase in cases, there will be restrictions. Again, restrictions. So we know that that's going to be the case. We can't make an effective impact on their decisions. So instead, what we need to do is adapt for the reality of the constraints within which we operate, and then make decisions going on the presumption that they will weigh human life highly. Does that answer your question, Wendy?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so you're basically saying we're just really should be looking at how they react.
Yep. Not how we'd react in their situation.
And then react to how they're reacting.
Exactly. Yep. That's the way that we should be thinking. That's how our decisions, and that's what our businesses are constrained by. In this case, government decision making, which has its ups and downs. Let's say it that way. Other folks.
Yeah, I have another question.
Yes.
When we open our doors again for businesses, apart from, let's say, taking temperature, and I'm not even sure if that's legal to do.
It's legal in a private business. You can say, you don't come into my store except, if you do X, you wear, you have a ponytail, that's up to you, right? So you can say you don't come into my store or whatever you have, unless you get your temperature taken. Or unless you can show me that you have an antibody test that guarantees that you're now immune to COVID-19, at least yourself. Maybe you could still infect others. I don't know.
So let's say you do a temperature check, you give them a mask, you give them gloves, you make sure that they're socially distanced. Is there anything else we can do so that our employees don't get sick and we don't get sued?
Yeah, getting sued is the big concern. I would say give your employees a lot of training on how to do social distancing. You can give them gloves, but there's going to be a lot of things that you need to take care of besides that. You need to give them training, professional development on how to do social distancing, but more importantly, why. A lot of people are not going to be believing COVID-19, they're not going to be taking it seriously. And it's unfortunate, but we clearly see that that's going to be the case. Probably some of your employees might be in that number, right? So you need to give them very clear policy guidelines about what they should do and how they should do it. So gloves, sanitizer, that's all part of it. Social distancing, 10 feet, that's part of it. You need to rearrange your office space to allow it social distancing, extensive social distancing, so that people don't have to pass each other by in the hallways. And you need to create a system for, if I want to pass you in the hallway, what are we going to do, right? So that's something that you need to think through. You need to think through every element of what your office would look like if you do choose to go back to the office. Again, that's not something I recommend, but if you do choose to do that, you need to think through every element. You need to have cleaning people there, disinfect it after every shift or after every workday. At the end of the workday, do a thorough disinfection, thorough cleaning of all the surfaces, because we know that COVID-19 can survive on various surfaces from a few hours to a few days, depending on the surface. So steel and plastic apparently can survive for a while. So it depends on the surface. So you want to research into that, and you want to figure out how you can replace some of the surfaces that hold COVID-19 for a while with coverings that hold COVID-19 for less time. So things like this, and maybe you want to have guidelines that, you know, you leave the doors open. You don't have you don't have a way of closing the doors so that you don't have people touching doorknobs, because doorknobs are a major spreader of COVID-19. So you want to think through every element of your office if that's something that you do choose to do, and how you can maximize the social distancing of it. You want to make sure that you're following best practices. So look at best practices so that you're legally protected. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, so you want to get a lawyer who will tell you that, hey, you will tell them that here are the steps I took. Is there anything else I need to be doing? Yes, Christina, did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
No, but I'm a lawyer, so if you need anything, just let me know.
Oh, perfect. Okay, there you go. Thank you, Christina. That's one
I did have
entrepreneurs organization. Yes, Chad.
I did have another question.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how much your studies get into this or your work, but what are your thoughts on whether we're going to have a recession from this or a massive depression?
So it depends on how you define depression. If you define depression by some of the metrics of fall of employment into, you know, to over 20% unemployment, yes, I think that that's going to be happening. So that's one way of defining depression, when you have unemployment of 20%, and that's, I think, it's going to be hard for us to avoid that. Let's say it that way. So in that case, whether we have there are other ways of defining a depression where where the definition is to have GDP, negative GDP of, you know, a year in a row. So do I think we'll have negative GDP growth, so decline in this year? I think so. I think if this year we'll have an actual decline in GDP. And that is another way of defining a depression. Whereas a recession is only 2 quarters of decline in GDP. Another way of defining a recession is 2 years of negative GDP, decline in GDP. So that, I'm not sure if 2021 will be a decline in GDP. I think it will depend on how well businesses adapt to the situation. If a lot of businesses do the smart thing, shift to virtual teams, shift their internal business model and their external business model, they'll be able to be much more productive. If a lot of people are smart about choosing which businesses they stay in and choosing which ones to get out of, we might well get to growth in 2021. But I think but that's kind of the most expansive possible definition of what a depression is. I think by the definition of 20% unemployment or 1 year of decline, I think we will be in this depression for 2020.
Okay.
Other folks? Anyone else?
I just wanted to say it was just a wonderful, not the most uplifting talk, but really informative, and I tremendously appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Yeah, I mean, lots of my talks are not very uplifting. They are meant to prevent disaster, and kind of when we're in the middle of a disaster, to manage a disaster. And when you're managing disaster, you never want to prepare for that. When you're preparing for disaster or managing it, you never want to be super optimistic. You want to be at least moderate, at least realistic, and ideally pessimistic. So a lot of my talks are like this, and I really hope they help you make the best decisions for your business.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. So seems like there's no more questions.
Well, I have one question. Do
Yeah,
you have
please.
2 earrings or 1?
Pardon me?
Your earring? Do you have 2 or 1?
Oh, 1 earring. So
okay.
Here, not in this one.
Thank you.
You're
I appreciate
very
your
welcome.
time.
You're
When is your new book coming out?
It's going to come up on May 1st, actually. So my publisher surprised me yesterday with the good news that they wanted to push the date from June 1st to May 1st. And I'm like, oh, okay. let me spend this weekend after my EO webinar just writing it and full into writing editing mode. So that's my weekend. It's going to be full of writing. Wish me luck.
Nice.
Good luck.
All right, folks. And again, if you have you want the 2 chapters on adapting and planning and a free coaching session with me or a free coaching session with me, tinyurl.com/d-event.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gleb. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome.